And we're live. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Internet.
Hi.
Good to see you again. I'm Sabine K. Bergman.
I'm Samani Babu.
We are the co-founders of Hidden Compass, and we have a guest today, Moriah Costa, who wrote the story Blue in Toulouse for us for our spring 2021 issue. And we're going to give her a fabulous introduction and get to chat with her about her story today. But we'll give people a few minutes to get settled and to arrive and join us.
Yes. So we actually wanted to ask you, Moriah, about your artwork, not for the story, but in general. Because in your profile with Hidden Compass, you mentioned that you make mixed media art journals. And we were wondering about that. That sounded interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do what's called art journaling. So basically, instead of just journaling like with words, I kind of use art, whether it's watercolors or collage or I don't know, smush some acrylic paint on a page, whatever it is I feel like in the moment, to kind of express myself. And also just kind of, it's kind of like having a combination of like a sketchbook and a diary kind of all in one. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes I'm just recording what happened that day. So it's kind of what I do. It's a way to kind of de-stress, and I really enjoy it. I enjoy art, so yeah.
Very neat.
You mentioned that you're the daughter of an artist. I also grew up with an artist in my household. My mom.
Same here. My mom as well. Yeah.
Her art studio, I remember as a kid just thinking it was some magical realm because I was not allowed inside, and there's all kinds of crazy alchemy happening in there. She had a dark room and so on. So what was it like for you growing up with an artist, and did you start picking that up when you were a kid?
Yeah, I mean, so my mom basically, if I was ever bored, my mom would just hand me a paintbrush. Or I remember one day, like I was like 5 or 6, really young, complaining, it was summer break, and complaining that I was bored. And so my mom was like, here, I'm going to teach you how to sew. And she taught me how to sew like doll clothes, like clothes for my dolls. And so, yeah, that kind of, it just kind of, I picked it up. My mom would just like, I don't know, it's just part of what you did. It was just, I didn't even think about it. It was just like, yeah, you know, you make art when you're bored. I don't know, like, it's just a day-to-day thing.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so similarly, as Sabine and as you, my mom's also an artist, and she would, and to be fair, both my parents are pretty artistic, but she would do the same. It was, she would hand me something to draw with or draw on, or we would sew things and do that sort of thing. So yeah, that brings back memories.
Yeah, it's funny how that can come back later in your life too and resurface.
Yeah,
Definitely.
for sure.
Definitely. Well, let's jump into your story. For everyone who's watching, we're here with Moriah Costa. Moriah is a Madrid-based freelance journalist and editor specializing in financial journalism, the business of cannabis, food, travel, and more. She has bylines in the Arizona Republic, CBD Intel, S&P Global, Thomson Reuters, and others. She worked as a reporter in Washington, D.C. And as we've been talking about, she's also the daughter of an artist. And her story in Hidden Compass is a quest piece called Blue in Toulouse. It is a story that she both wrote and painted and illustrated. So we're excited to talk about both parts of those. It's a story about a largely forgotten Renaissance era boom and bust story of woad that explores the realm of color alchemy and royal intrigue and touches on how certain histories can be lost but later found. So we're excited to chat about that.
Yeah. And for those of you who have never heard of woad before, well, you should read the story if you haven't already. But we're talking about a plant and a pigment that had quite a large influence on French history. So we usually start, Moriah, by asking our journalists how the stories come across their radar. So, I wonder how this became a story for you, because you had this personal quest to go and experience this. You read this book and were inspired to go learn more. But how did this become a story?
Yeah, so yeah, like I mentioned in the article, I first kind of came about the woad through an article, or sorry, a book that I read. And actually, funny enough, so my husband is actually, he's French, and he's actually from the region of Toulouse. And so that's kind of how it kind of became more of a story, because I had a bit of a personal connection. Because I remember my in-laws mentioning in the past, like very like in French they call it pastel, and so they're like, oh yeah, pastel, it's a thing in this region. And I was just like, oh okay. And I just had no idea. It was like, okay, don't really know what that has to do with like art, or it didn't really dawn on me that it was a color until I read this book.
Mm-hmm.
And then I made the connection and I was like, oh. And then I was just like, oh, I want to find out more. And so it's just kind of that curiosity and having that connection as well. And just also the opportunity, because we spend, you know, usually like a lot of people in Europe, we take August off, or we try and take some time off in August. And so we always go to my in-laws house in August. And so I kind of had the opportunity to actually sit down and be like, okay, so let's go to these chateaus, let's explore. And thankfully my in-laws and my husband were just as interested and fascinated with the topic. And so they're like, yeah, sure, let's go to a chateau. Like, why not?
Yeah. Yeah. And did you know that it was going to become an article, or was it just you were driven to learn more? And as you were experiencing it, you thought, oh, maybe this could be something that I write and later illustrate?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when I was first looking into it, I was like, oh, I want to find out more about this. I was thinking about, oh, maybe I could take a workshop, which I did end up taking, but it was just more like, oh, I just want to learn what more about this. And then as I was researching it, I was like, ooh, this is really interesting. And there were a few articles written here and there, but they weren't in depth, and there was no like historical significance really. They just mentioned like, oh yeah, it was very, you know, historically defining, like it's been around since the Middle Ages, etc. And so I just was like, oh, I want to write about this. Like that sounds really interesting. I want to, you know, go there and then write about it, write about my experience. But I wanted to do something that was a bit more in depth and like, hey, here's things to do in Toulouse, and there's this pastel thing you could do, right? So I wanted to have something like a travel article but that's something that was more in depth and actually brought you, and so that you could like experience the same thing, you know, I was going through or I was experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I love about this story is that you get to interact directly with this pigment, but then you're also it's a quest story and there are multiple aspects to the quest, but part of it is you going through history and the amount of research that went into this piece, which we love at Hidden Compass. We were excited to assign the story, and I remember seeing this come in and thinking, well, you know, oftentimes we humans take riches and wealth and possibility for granted, and I was excited about running a story about how fragile a golden era can be, and the boom and bust aspect of this is something that really called to me as an editor and a publisher.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and I mentioned it before on these article clubs that I am a sucker for historical stories. I'm kind of the resident history nerd, and I love that this was uncovering a historical mystery. And but part of it that also excited me was the historical mystery that it was uncovering. I had just read a book called Tom's River, which is a very different story, but there is a section of the book that is all about the history of commercial dyeing and that industry. And it was such a fascinating topic, and just the history of dyes in general. And so this was another piece of that history about an industry that we don't often think about and get to read about, particularly in sort of the travel exploration sphere. So I was really excited about that.
Yeah.
But why was this a story you wanted to tell? So you talked about how it became a story, but why was it a story that you needed to tell?
I guess I mean, there's kind of that artistic element. Like I mean, I love pigment. So I actually make my own watercolors. I work with pigments. I do a lot of research on pigments, looking at like, when I think about, okay, what pigment do I want to use? I try and, you know, not just like, oh, is it a good pigment or is it a color I like, but also looking at, is it a rare color? Where does it come from? How is it made? Is it toxic? All that, because a lot of pigments are actually toxic. And so there was that kind of artistic element of being like, one, you know, I love color, and I love the color blue. Blue happens to be my favorite color. And so because I had that kind of background in art, I know like how much, like how difficult it is to kind of create these pigments. and how rare they are and how expensive they are as well. And so that's also kind of that element of that artistic element was something that really drew me to the story as well.
Yeah. And it's so interesting thinking of blue in particular. I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with the story of indigo, but the story of woad, you don't really see that often. And so it's a story that isn't told as much as it should be. And it's fascinating too.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that was part of it. It was because it's very similar to indigo. It's like the plant is basically, it's like a cousin or a sister, really. And the color itself, there are some similarities. Like it's hard to kind of, unless you really know, to see the difference, right? And so yeah, there's definitely, everyone knows about indigo. There's been a huge, a lot of research and into indigo. A lot of books have been written about it. But very few people, of course, know about woad, and it's a European-based plant, really. Not originally, but it became a European plant. And so that I was like, why don't people talk about this more? Why is there this indigo? Everyone talks about indigo, and there's this indigo revival and dyeing things with pure indigo and everything. But not many people know that there's another indigo that existed before indigo became popular.
Yeah, and that it had such an influence on the fabric of society, so this is a quest department piece. It was veering into time travel as well, because you got to go back in time and bring Renaissance era France to life. What was that experience like, drafting those scenes and bringing in a different historical context, but in a cinematic form?
Yeah, that was really fun and also very challenging. I've never written that kind of cinematic of articles before, so it was definitely a challenge for me, but it was also very fun because I really got to take my creative side, take that artistic side that I have and use it in my writing, which I think is very rare in journalism. Like, it happens obviously, but it's very rare, especially in business journalism, which is where my background is. It's very cut and dry, very numbers based. So it was really fascinating and really fun to be able to, think about, reimagine what would it have been like, but also basing it on the historical context, looking at old texts, trying to figure out, okay, so what would it have been like when the king came to visit? Who was there? What were they wearing? And looking at, I was looking at old illustrations and, old texts and Google translating them from the original French and all that. And so that was, it was a really fun process and a process that I'd never undertaken before, but something I really enjoyed doing and something that hopefully I'll be able to do again.
Very nice. Well, you did it beautifully in this story, and so I hope you get to do it again, because it was a lot of fun to read. I asked a question earlier about why this was a story you wanted to tell, but we like to kind of flip that and ask the question, why is this a story that we as readers, as an audience, need to hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has been a lot of, I think one of the aspects that kind of goes into like the boom and bust cycle is kind of, and one angle that I remember thinking, oh, should I talk about this or not? We went back and forth during the editing process, is the aspect of the boom and bust and the aspect of kind of technologies today, and how it's kind of, basically these boom and bust cycles happen quite frequently, right? Like it's not something we think of boom and bust as like a economic term. This is my business journalism coming in. It's a new economic term and Keynes and everything. But actually it's something that's been going on since there's been civilization, right? And so it's just another example of like, look, here's an industry that, when one area becomes too reliant on an industry, when that industry fails, or declines, which ultimately, as historically, we've seen it will, then that region is going to also decline. And you've seen that with like in Detroit with the like audio industry. In Toulouse currently, there's a huge there's a lot of the airline industry. It has a big influence there currently. So it's kind of like, is history really repeating itself? And so that it just kind of tells the story of like, well, kind of does. And here's just another reason why. So yeah.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is how you can see a region decline after a bust of one, the central commodity that it has been building itself around. But then another aspect of the story that's so interesting is that story gets kind of lost to history in a way. And so not only did the region change, but then you had to, as a journalist and as a traveler, dig to get the details back.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We mentioned you're a seasoned journalist and editor. You talk about, your work in financial journalism. But in one way, this story was a first for you because you wrote it, but you also illustrated it.
Yes.
And so as publishers, we're really excited to bring in a journalist who has an artistic perspective for this story and made not only the artwork, but the watercolor itself. So what did that element bring to the story, and what was that like for your experience of telling it?
Yeah, I mean, it was really fun to actually make it and be like, I'm working on this historical pigment that still exists. It was very difficult to actually find the pigment itself. I had to do a lot of digging and being like, how can I get this pigment? Because not many places sell it. And so when I finally got it, I was very excited to try it out. And I feel like it added another connection to the story. Especially because I was actually, the illustrations are of the plant itself and of the place, the chateaus that I went to. And so that was just really like, anytime, I mean, I guess backtrack a little bit. So anytime I travel, I always make an art journal, and I always do like a travel journal, and I do illustrations of where I travel. And it's a way for me to like kind of keep memories. Instead of scrapbooks, I make art journals and I illustrate what I see. And so that was really interesting for me because in a way I was art journaling, or I was creating a memory of the article that I wrote, and like building that connection. And so that really helped me like I now have like those illustrations, the originals, as like a memory of like, oh yeah, I went there and I wrote this story, instead of just remembering, oh yeah, I wrote that story once. I have like an actual, I could, frame the photo and put it up and be like, hey, yeah, I actually made that, and this is why.
It's very neat. And it was great to just, as the reader, to be able to see what that pigment looked like, because that would have been the piece that we felt as a reader would feel was missing. We just read this really fascinating story, but then couldn't actually see it. And so from that perspective, it brought so much to the story as well.
Yeah. I think this is a good moment to talk about our hopes for the story. So as publishers and as editors, when we put a story out into the world, we have these secret, well, not anymore because we do these article clubs and we share them, but we have these hopes for every story that we publish. And we had talked about this element of boom and bust throughout this conversation today. But for me, I think my greatest hope for this story is that it challenges us to not take for granted the sources of wealth we have today, and to kind of step back and look for perhaps elements of gratitude, and think about not putting all of our eggs in a very volatile basket, perhaps.
Yeah, well, and also the benefit of this story doing that is, the possibility of more economic stability.
Yes, gratitude and economic stability. Good pair.
It's a good pair. No, I mean, I think that's a great hope for a story like this. I share that hope, but I also hope that it just gets people jazzed about history and the idea that history is in everything we enjoy, and that there are these historical mysteries, that it's not all about, as much as I enjoy military history and World War II history, but there's also so much history in the things that we take for granted. And so I hope that it convinces people that there are fascinating stories to tell, that everything old is new again, which I think we get with the whole boom and bust. But also that history can be revived, that it doesn't have to be lost forever, and that there are stories to dig up. So, Moriah, what's your greatest hope for this story?
I guess my greatest hope is that people learn to think a little bit more about kind of the historical significance of everyday things, like a color, right? The dye that is used to, the orange of your blouse, there's, well, why orange? Where did it come from? So I hope that people kind of learn to kind of think about that, and also to realize that these little things, really can have a huge impact on a place. And hopefully when they travel, they think about, well, what's the real story? What's the untold story here of the place that I'm visiting?
I love that.
It's great.
I hope that those of you who are watching who've read the story have gotten one of those elements out of it, and perhaps you're inspired to read it again. And those who haven't read it yet, by all means, go to Hidden Compass and check out the story Blue in Toulouse, and go over to Moriah's profile page and learn more about her as a journalist, and you can read more of her work. Moriah, is there a place that people can go to learn more about you and to support you directly?
Yeah, so I have a website, moriahcosta.com, and I'm also on Instagram. I have an art Instagram where I post my art journals, and it's called Illustrated Life of Myrrh, MYRRH, over on Instagram.
Wonderful. And as always, this story has an active campaign associated with it. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, if you've enjoyed this story, contribute to that campaign. We split the proceeds of those campaigns 50-50 with the contributor, who in this case is Moriah. And that's in addition to what we pay our journalists. So do check it out. Do check out the campaigns for other stories. We will be back next week, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone then. In the meantime, thank you so much, Moriah, for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.